Her father gambled away her future. The sheriff gave her back her name Clara. Whitfield found the notice nailed to the land office door on a Tuesday morning in April. And the world she had known for 24 years came apart in the time it took her to read 11 lines of legal text. Her father had signed the deed to their Laramie homestead, the land her mother was buried on. The land Clara had worked every season of her life to cover a gambling debt run up over 3 nights at the Silver Spur Saloon. He left no letter and no explanation. He was on the westbound stage before dawn, leaving behind nothing but an empty whiskey glass and a daughter standing alone on a street that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Harlan Briggs arrived the next morning with 2 hired men and a folded legal document, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who already knew the outcome before he knocked. He was wide and deliberate, with small calculating eyes that moved across the homestead like he was already measuring what he would change and what he would keep. Clara met him in the doorway with her chin lifted and her voice steadier than she felt inside, and told him plainly that she would not be leaving. Briggs smiled the patient smile of a man with the law behind him and unlimited time ahead of him. He gave her until noon the following day, turned his horse, and rode back toward town without a second glance. Sheriff Eli Kane rode out that same evening just as the last light was draining from the sky, and Clara braced herself for the conversation she had been dreading since morning. He was not what she had prepared herself for. Quiet and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and steady deep-set eyes that moved slowly and missed nothing, he carried himself with a kind of grounded calm that made the air around him feel less dangerous. He sat down at her kitchen table without waiting to be invited, set his hat beside him, and asked her to tell him everything from the very beginning. Something in the unhurried weight of his attention made her feel that the truth would be treated carefully in his hands, and so she told him all of it. Her father, the debt, the deed, the morning she found the notice, nailed to that door until the lantern burned low and the night pressed cold against the windows. 3 days of hard riding followed while Eli worked through county records in the rain. He pulled the original homestead deed and read every line with the patience of a man who understood that the truth was almost always buried in the details other people skipped over. He examined the gambling contract Briggs had filed with the clerk. He rode to 2 neighboring counties to trace the chain of ownership back through 30 years of transfers, and in a land ledger dated 1863 he found exactly what Harlan Briggs had been counting on no one ever finding. Clara's mother had filed a homestead claim in her own name before her marriage, a claim that passed directly and solely to Clara upon her death, with no legal authority granted to her father at any point in the chain. The debt contract Briggs was holding had never been valid. It had been worthless from the moment Warren Whitfield signed it. On the 4th morning, Eli returned to the homestead with the county clerk riding beside him and a corrected deed folded carefully in his coat pocket. He knocked, waited for Clara to open the door, and handed the document to her without ceremony or speech, the way a man returns something that was never his to carry in the first place. Clara unfolded it slowly and read her own name printed across the top in clean, permanent ink. Clara May Whitfield, followed by every acre of the homestead, recorded and witnessed and beyond challenge. She read it twice to make certain it was real. Then she looked up at Eli standing quietly on her porch in the pale morning light and asked him why he had spent 4 days riding in the rain for a woman he had never spoken to before that first evening. He picked up his hat from the porch railing, turned it once slowly in his hands, and told her that the law was supposed to mean something in this county, and that as long as he was the man wearing the badge, he intended to make sure it did. Then he nodded once, settled the hat back onto his head, and walked down the steps to his horse. Clara stood on the porch and watched him ride the length of the dirt path until the dust settled back over the road and silence returned to the land around her. She was still holding the deed. Her name was still on it, and standing there in the morning light on soil that was hers and had always been hers, she felt something return that she had not realized was missing until this exact moment. The quiet, unshakable steadiness that comes not from being rescued by someone stronger, but from being seen honestly by someone who had every reason to look the other way and made a different choice. Her brother sold her land to pay his debt. The stranger returned every acre and stayed 3 weeks after her brother Daniel vanished into the Kansas plains. Rose Calloway stood at the edge of the wheat field her grandfather had planted 40 years ago and watched a man she had never seen before walk the boundary line with a surveyor and a copy of a deed bearing Daniel's signature at the bottom. The debt had been $500 owed to a cattle broker named Silas Pruitt. Money lost not through misfortune or drought or any of the honest hardships that took things from farming families in Texas, but through deliberate choices made at card tables across 3 counties over the better part of a year. Rather than face what he owed, Daniel had signed over the Calloway land, every acre of it, and was gone before the ink had fully dried. He sent no letter. He offered no word of warning or apology. He simply erased 30 years of his family's history with a single pen stroke and rode north, leaving Rose to discover what he had done when the surveyor's wagon appeared at the edge of her field on a gray October morning. The stranger walking her land was named Cord Ellison, tall and spare, dressed in worn trail clothes, with the quiet, unhurried manner of a man who had spent more years under open sky than beneath any roof. He had purchased the deed from Pruitt for the full amount without ever visiting the property, which struck Rose as a peculiar way to acquire land. When she crossed the field to confront him, she had prepared herself for coldness or the casual indifference of a man who owned more than he needed and viewed 1 more acre as simply 1 more number in a ledger. Instead, Cord stopped walking the moment she spoke, turned to face her fully, and listened to everything she said with a quality of attention she had rarely encountered in anyone, unhurried, undefensive, genuinely present in a way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with actually hearing her. She told him about her grandfather turning the first furrow in that soil with a borrowed plow. She told him about her father building the farmhouse board by board with his own hands over 2 summers. She told him far more than she had intended to, because something about the stillness with which he stood made her feel that her words would land somewhere solid, rather than dissolve into the air the way they had every other time she had tried to explain to someone what this land meant to her. Family. Cord said very little that first afternoon. He asked 2 questions, listened carefully to both answers, thanked her for her time, and rode back into Millhaven without making any promises or commitments of any kind. Rose returned to the farmhouse telling herself she had accomplished nothing and should prepare herself for the reality of what was coming. But Cord returned the following morning before she had finished her coffee, and the morning after that, and every morning for the following week. He walked every field from corner to corner and inspected every fence line. He spent long afternoons in conversation with the neighboring farmers who had known her grandfather and her father, asking questions about the land's history and the decisions that had shaped it over 40 years. Rose watched him from the porch each day and found that she could not determine what he was doing or what he ultimately wanted from any of it. He did not carry himself like a man in the process of taking possession of something new. He carried himself like a man trying to fully understand the weight and history of something he was not yet certain he had the right to hold. On the 8th morning, Cord arrived at the farmhouse earlier than usual and knocked at the front door rather than appearing at the field's edge the way he had all week. Rose opened the door and he asked, without preamble, whether he might come in and sit down for a few minutes. He took the chair across the kitchen table from her, set his hat on the table beside him, and slid a folded document across the wood toward her without any introduction or explanation. Rose picked it up and opened it slowly. It was a new deed, properly transferred and witnessed by the county clerk, with her name printed cleanly and permanently across the top line. Rose Ellen Calloway, above every acre of the Calloway family land. Cord had paid Prout the full $500 out of his own pocket and was asking for nothing in return except to know whether the old foreman's cabin at the north edge of the property might be available for a man who had been riding from one place to the next for too many years and had begun to feel, somewhere on the road between buying that deed and walking that wheat field, that he would very much like somewhere quiet to finally stop. Rose looked at the document in her hands and then looked at the man sitting across the table from her, and understood with a clarity that arrived quietly and without fanfare that some people do not come into your life to take something from it. Some people arrive precisely when everything has been stripped away and they bring it back. And then they stay. 6 months after Philip Marsh's second life in St. Louis became public knowledge, Eleanor was still the one paying for it. Philip himself had been gone within a week of the exposure, slipping out of Harrogate, Missouri on a Tuesday morning with a traveling bag and the particular ease of a man who had been quietly preparing his exit for some time. He left behind a wife, an empty business account, and a town that had reorganized itself around the scandal with remarkable speed and efficiency. The second household had existed for 4 years, a woman in St. Louis, 2 small children, an entire parallel life funded by money Eleanor had believed was going toward their dry goods business. She had kept the books herself. She had balanced every column and felt proud of what they were building together, and every number she had carefully recorded had been, in some portion she would never be able to calculate exactly, a lie. Philip was gone and rebuilding himself somewhere new under the cover of distance and fresh beginnings. Eleanor remained in Harrogate, walking the same streets every day, shopping at the same stores, sitting in the same church pew, carrying shame that belonged entirely to someone else because there was nowhere else to put it and no one offering to take it from her. She had found work as a seamstress, which kept her fed and barely housed in 2 rooms above a hardware store on the quieter end of Main Street. The work was careful and solitary and suited the version of herself she had become: small, precise, occupying as little space as possible, drawing as little attention as the gown would allow her to draw. She had grown so practiced at invisibility that she was genuinely startled the afternoon Dr. James Whitmore stopped beside her work table at the dry goods store and spoke to her directly and without the elaborate, careful neutrality that most of Harrogate had adopted when addressing her. The particular tone that was somehow worse than open hostility, because it announced its own generosity while delivering nothing real. James said he needed a housekeeper for his medical office, someone organized and discreet, capable of managing schedules and supplies and the particular kind of quiet that a medical practice required. He had heard she was both organized and discreet, and was asking whether she would be willing to come speak with him about the position. He said it the way a man says something when he means exactly what he is saying and nothing more. And the plainness of it felt like cold water after 6 months of navigating other people's careful performances of tolerance. The position suited her in ways she had not expected and could not have predicted from the outside. James ran his office with a focused precision that she found herself matching naturally and without effort, as though some part of her that had been operating at a fraction of its capacity for the past 6 months had been quietly waiting for something worthy of its full attention. He was methodical and thorough and genuinely uninterested in wasting time on appearances, which made the office a relief to work in after months of a town that was almost entirely concerned with appearances. What surprised her most was the way he treated her observations. Eleanor noticed things, small details about the patients she moved around while cleaning and organizing, shifts in color or posture or breathing that seemed worth mentioning. She mentioned them once, tentatively, expecting to be thanked politely and redirected to her actual responsibilities. Instead, James asked her 3 follow-up questions and incorporated what she had told him into his examination notes without comment, as though her observations were simply useful information that had arrived through a reliable channel and deserved to be treated accordingly. He asked her opinion regularly after that, on scheduling, on supplies, on the small organizational decisions that shaped how the office functioned each day. And he waited for the full answer before responding, which was something Eleanor had not experienced so consistently in so long that she had nearly stopped expecting it from anyone. The moment that changed everything came on a cold Wednesday evening in February, when the last patient had gone, and the office had settled into the particular quiet that Eleanor had come to value as the best part of each working day. James set down his pen, folded his hands on the desk, and told her directly that he had received a letter from a colleague in Jefferson City asking him to provide a character statement for Philip Marsh, who was attempting to establish a new medical supply business and had listed James as a professional reference from his Harrogate years. James looked at Eleanor across the desk and told her that before he wrote a single word in response, he wanted to know what she thought he should write, not what was convenient or socially manageable or least likely to cause difficulty for either of them. What was true? He asked for her honest answer the way a man asks for something he genuinely needs, treating her judgment on the matter as exactly the most relevant and informed opinion available, which it was, because she had kept Philip's books for 6 years and knew precisely what kind of man he was in the places where character revealed itself most clearly, in numbers. in small decisions, in the gap between what was recorded and what was real. Eleanor looked at James sitting across from her in the lamplight of the quiet office, asking for her honest answer as though it were the most natural thing in the world to request from a woman who had spent 6 months being managed and handled and carefully spoken around, and felt something she had packed away so deliberately and so deep that she had nearly convinced herself it was gone for good, begin to come slowly and irreversibly loose from its wrappings. The way ice releases in March, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that once it has begun, there is no going back to the cold. May Donovan stood at the back of the crowd for 2 full hours and never once looked away. That was the thing people remembered afterward, not that she had come to the auction, which everyone expected, but that she had stayed for every minute of it without flinching, without leaving, without allowing herself the small mercy of turning her back on what was happening. The Caldwell, Kansas morning was bright and merciless, and the bank auctioneer worked through the Donovan Ranch inventory with the brisk efficiency of a man with 4 more stops on his schedule before sundown. The cattle went first, then the equipment, then the land itself in 3 parcels that the auctioneer described in the flat neutral language of legal documents, stripping away 40 years of her family's history and reducing it to acreage and soil classification and water access. May's father had built that ranch from a single borrowed loan and 2 decades of work that started before sunrise every morning of her childhood. He had died 3 months ago, owing the bank more than the land was worth. The result of one bad financial decision, made in a drought year that had compounded quietly and relentlessly for 5 years until there was no longer any way to outrun it. May had spent the 3 months since his death filing appeals and writing letters and writing twice to the county seat to argue her case before men who listened to everything she said, with the patient courtesy of people who have already made their decision and are simply waiting for the conversation to conclude. She had done everything available to her within the boundaries of the law, and it had not been sufficient. And so she stood at the back of the crowd on that July morning and watched every piece of what her father had built pass into other hands, because looking away felt like a surrender she was not willing to make, and she believed, in some way she could not have articulated precisely, that witnessing it fully was the last thing she could do for him. They auctioned her father's ranch while she watched. The quiet man bought it back and handed her the deed. May Donovan stood at the back of the crowd for 2 full hours and never once looked away. That was the thing people remembered afterward, not that she had come to the auction, which everyone expected, but that she had stayed for every minute of it without flinching, without leaving, without allowing herself the small mercy of turning her back on what was happening. The Caldwell, Kansas morning was bright and merciless, and the bank auctioneer worked through the Donovan Ranch inventory with the brisk efficiency of a man with 4 more stops on his schedule before sundown. The cattle went first, then the equipment, then the land itself in 3 parcels that the auctioneer described in the flat neutral language of legal documents, stripping away 40 years of her family's history and reducing it to acreage and soil classification and water access. May's father had built that ranch from a single borrowed loan and 2 decades of work that started before sunrise every morning of her childhood. He had died 3 months ago, owing the bank more than the land was worth. The result of one bad financial decision, made in a drought year that had compounded quietly and relentlessly for 5 years until there was no longer any way to outrun it. May had spent the 3 months since his death filing appeals and writing letters and writing twice to the county seat to argue her case. Before men who listened to everything she said, with the patient courtesy of people who have already made their decision and are simply waiting for the conversation to conclude. She had done everything available to her within the boundaries of the law, and it had not been sufficient. And so she stood at the back of the crowd on that July morning and watched every piece of what her father had built pass into other hands, because looking away felt like a surrender she was not willing to make, and she believed, in some way she could not have articulated precisely, that witnessing it fully was the last thing she could do for him. The man who purchased the land itself, all 3 parcels, in 3 consecutive bids made in a low, unhurried voice, stood near the edge of the crowd and showed no visible interest in the proceedings beyond the bids themselves. He was lean and weathered, somewhere in his mid-30s, dressed in good but plain clothes, with the self-contained stillness of a man accustomed to making decisions without consulting anyone, and comfortable with the quiet that followed. His name, May learned from the woman standing beside her, was Samuel Greer. He ran a substantial cattle operation 2 counties east, and was known in Caldwell as a man of considerable means and very few words. He had apparently purchased the Donovan land without visiting it beforehand, which struck May as a strange basis on which to spend that kind of money, and the strangeness of it stayed with her through the remainder of the auction and into the long, silent ride back to the boarding house, where she had been staying since the foreclosure notice arrived. She found him the following afternoon at the feed store on the east end of town, and approached him with the deliberate composure of a woman who has decided that dignity costs something and has chosen to pay it anyway. She introduced herself, told him she was Thomas Donovan's daughter, and asked him directly and without softening what he intended to do with her father's ranch. Samuel looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately classify, not unkind, not dismissive, simply attentive in the way of a man who takes incoming information seriously before responding to it. Then, instead of answering her question, he asked her one of his own. He wanted to know what she would do with the ranch if it were hers to decide. The question caught her off guard because it was not what she had prepared herself for, and because it assumed, without making any show of assuming, that her answer would be worth hearing. May answered without pausing because she had been answering that question in her own mind every day for 3 months, refining it and expanding it during the long evenings in the boarding house, when there was nothing to do but think about what she would have done differently and what she would do now if anyone gave her the chance. She talked about the south pasture fencing that needed replacing before winter made it impossible. She talked about the breeding stock her father had been planning to bring in the spring before he got sick. She talked about the irrigation ditch on the north edge of the property that he had started digging 2 summers ago and never finished, and what finishing it properly would mean for the water situation in a dry year. She talked for the better part of 10 minutes before she became aware of how much she had said to a complete stranger who had offered her nothing and promised her nothing and had no particular obligation to stand in a feed store listening to her. And she stopped herself and thanked him for his time and turned to leave. 2 days later, Samuel Greer appeared in the doorway of the boarding house in the early evening with his hat in both hands and told her that he had been to the county clerk's office that morning. The deed to the Donovan Ranch had been transferred into her name, all 3 parcels, the full acreage, exactly as her father had held it. The bank debt had been settled in full. He was not asking for repayment or arrangement of any kind. May stood in the narrow hallway of the boarding house and looked at the man in the doorway and asked him, in a voice that was steadier than she felt, why a man she had never met before 2 days ago would do something like that for a woman he had no connection to and no obligation toward. Samuel was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing words he means to stand behind permanently. Then he told her that he had watched her stand at the back of that auction for 2 hours without once looking away from something that must have been extraordinarily painful to watch, and that a person who loved something with that kind of unflinching loyalty deserved to have it back. He handed her the deed, nodded once, and said that he hoped the irrigation ditch turned out the way she had described. Then he put his hat on and walked back out into the evening. May stood in the hallway for a long time after his footsteps faded from the porch. The deed was in her hands. Her name was on it in clean permanent ink above every acre her father had worked and every acre she had promised herself she would not stop fighting for. She had fought for it through every legal channel available to her and lost. And then a quiet man she had spoken to twice had simply handed it back to her as though the only question worth asking was whether she deserved it, and had concluded without apparent difficulty that she did. Standing there in the narrow hallway of the boarding house with the deed pressed between her palms, May Donovan felt the version of herself that still believed she was worth fighting for step quietly and firmly back into the room, and this time she intended to let her stay. Her husband traded her to settle a debt. The mountain man refused the trade and offered his cabin on a reeve. Had been riding in the back of Gus Holt's wagon for 3 days before she allowed herself to fully understand what had happened to her. There was a period in the first hours after Warren told her to get her coat, standing in the doorway of the cabin they had shared for 2 years in Denver, speaking to a point somewhere past her left shoulder rather than meeting her eyes, when she had told herself there was an explanation she had not yet been given. Some context that would make the situation legible and bearable once it was revealed. That period ended on the second night when Holt made camp beside a creek in the Colorado foothills, and she found the document in the supply box while he slept, a single folded page, signed by Warren Reeve at the bottom, transferring her as settlement of a debt, the way a man transfers a horse or a plot of land or any other asset he has grown tired of maintaining. Warren had owed Holt money for the better part of a year, accumulated through a series of transactions that Anna had known nothing about, and when his money ran out entirely, he had offered what remained. Holt had accepted without negotiation. The transfer had been agreed upon, documented, and signed before Anna had any knowledge that she was being discussed as a solution to someone else's problem. She folded the document back the way she had found it, returned it to the supply box, and sat beside the cold creek in the dark for a long time, understanding with a clarity that was almost physical that the man she had married had looked at the full inventory of his life and concluded that she was the most expendable item in it. The wagon stopped on the 3rd afternoon at a trading post near the base of the San Juan Mountains, a low-built structure of weathered timber that served as resupply point, mail stop, and meeting ground for the scattered population of trappers, traders, and mountain ranchers who moved through that part of the Colorado Territory. Holt needed provisions for the journey north and spent the first hour at the post in conversation with the man behind the counter while Anna sat on the bench outside and watched the mountains and tried to construct some version of a plan from the very limited materials available to her. She had no money. She had no family within 500 miles. She had the clothes she was wearing and a small bag she had packed in the 10 minutes Warren gave her before Holt's wagon pulled away from the cabin. And she had 3 days of accumulated understanding of exactly how little any of that amounted to in her current situation. Jonah Crest arrived at the trading post in the middle of that first hour, coming down from the mountain on a gray horse with 2 pack mules behind him, moving with the unhurried economy of a man for whom this journey was routine and unremarkable. He was somewhere past 40, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a beard going gray at the edges and deep-set eyes that took in the trading post and everything around it in a single slow sweep that missed nothing. He came twice a year to trade furs and resupply, and he was known at the post the way solitary men of long-established routine are known in remote places, not intimately, but completely, with the particular reliable familiarity of someone whose character has been demonstrated consistently over many years and many transactions. He tied his animals at the post rail, nodded to Anna without stopping, and went inside. She heard the conversation begin to shift from inside the post perhaps 20 minutes later. Holt's voice took on the particular tone of a man moving from pleasantries toward business, and Anna recognized the transition because she had been listening carefully to every word Holt said for 3 days. She could not hear everything clearly through the timber wall, but she heard enough, her name used once, then the word trade, then the word mules, then a silence that stretched longer than any silence in the conversation had stretched before. What followed the silence was a single word in a voice she had not heard before, spoken at a volume so level and unhurried that the room inside must have had to go quiet to receive it properly. The word was no. Not raised, not sharpened, not decorated with explanation or apology. Just no, delivered with the flat finality of a man declining something that does not interest him and does not require further discussion. Holt pushed. Anna could hear that clearly enough, his voice climbing slightly, taking on the reasoning tone of a man who believes the right arrangement of practical arguments will eventually move any obstacle. The mules were the best in the territory, and he needed them for the northern passage, and this was a fair trade by any reasonable measure, and Jonah ought to consider it seriously before turning it down. Jonah's responses were short and consistent and entirely unmoved. He told Holt to find another way to pay for the mules. He told him there were other mules in the territory, and Holt would locate them if he looked. When Holt's tone shifted a third time into something harder and less reasonable, Anna heard the sound of a chair being pushed back from a table, and then Jonah's voice came through the wall at a register so quiet and so absolutely certain that it required the elimination of every other sound to exist in the room properly. He said that the woman outside would not be part of any transaction on that day or on any other day, and that Holt should think with considerable care before saying another word on the subject. A long silence followed. Holt said nothing more on the subject. The conversation moved, stiffly and with effort, to other matters. Jonah came outside 20 minutes later and found Anna still on the bench. He sat down at the far end of it, not close, and looked at the mountains for a moment, the way a man looks at something familiar that still deserves attention. Then he turned and told her, without introduction or preamble, that his cabin was half a day's ride up the eastern face of the mountain. It had a main room and a second room. The second room had a door with a bolt on the inside that he had installed himself, and that held without difficulty against anything likely to test it. She was welcome to stay in that room for as long as she needed to while she determined what she wanted to do next and how she intended to do it. He was not asking for anything in exchange for the offer, and he was not attaching any conditions to it. He was making it because she appeared to need somewhere to be, and he had somewhere available, and the arithmetic of that seemed straightforward to him. He would be leaving within the hour if she wanted to make use of it. If she did not, he understood, and he wished her well regardless. Anna looked at this man sitting at the far end of the bench in the afternoon light of the Colorado mountains. A man who had said no on her behalf to someone twice his size in a room full of people who were not going to say it for her, and who was now offering her shelter with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone performing an action that required no more justification than its own obvious necessity, and felt something shift in the locked and frozen interior of the past 3 days. She had spent 2 years married to a man who had looked at her and seen a liability. She had spent 3 days in a wagon belonging to a man who had looked at her and seen a commodity. The man at the other end of this bench had looked at her and seen a person in a difficult situation who could use a room with a bolt on the inside, and had offered exactly that, clearly and without theater, and was now waiting for her answer with the patience of someone who understood that a person who had been handled as badly as she had been handled recently needed to be given space and time and silence before she could trust her own response to anything. Anna told him she would take the room. Jonah nodded once, stood up, and went to prepare the mules for the return journey up the mountain. And Anna sat on the bench for another minute in the thin Colorado sunshine, holding the first decision she had made entirely for herself in longer than she could accurately remember, and found that it felt more solid beneath her than anything had felt in a very long time.